The average age of a millionaire in the US is 57. It often takes 30 to 40 years for an average person to build a net worth of over $1 million. But what if I told you that there are countries where you become a millionaire just by being born there? It sounds like a fairy tale, but it turns out that there is at least one such country. This tiny country in the desert is wealthier than the US, UK, Germany, or even Switzerland. Every newborn gets $1.5 million deposited in their bank account. As of 2023, every citizen of Qatar is a millionaire. But just 50 years ago, this place was literally a desert. This is how Qatar used to look just 40 or 50 years ago. So, how did this tiny nation go from this to this? How did it manage to turn all of its citizens into multi-millionaires? Unlike its neighbors, Qatar is less rich in oil than its neighbors. Most of the oil in the Middle East is located in Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and UAE. That is why, up until 1990s, while its neighbors thrived, Qatar remained relatively poor. The oil didn't just revolutionize the Middle East from a desert into some of the wealthiest nations on earth, but even was the cause behind the United States' miraculous growth in the late 19th and the beginning of the 20th century. That is why when Qatar discovered the largest ever gas field in its offshore, it wasn't revolutionary, since unlike oil, natural gas can't be transported across the globe in ship tankers. Both Qatar and oil companies were not excited, since the demand for natural gas was minimal. The only country that took the best advantage out of natural gas was Russia, since it built a direct pipeline to Europe, but it wasn't an option for Qatar, since the pipeline had to go through different countries. And Qatar's only option was to meet the demand in East Asia, which made it practically impossible. However, Qatar didn't give up since it had no other choice. It heavily invested in finding a way to transport its natural gas, so it revolutionized the industry by cooling down the natural gas to liquid form and then transporting it in huge tank ships. At the same time, economies in East Asia, South Korea, Japan, and Taiwan were growing exponentially, which later came to be known as the Asian Tigers. So the demand for Qatar's natural gas exploded. Overnight, tens of billions of dollars started flowing into this country. Unlike other oil-rich countries that easily extracted oil that was initially in liquid form, Qatar went through the hard way to learn how to transport LNG, so it carefully managed the money it had earned. It started building skyscrapers, roads, bridges, schools, universities. The country went from a desert into a 21st century city overnight. But that wasn't enough. If Qatar truly wanted to be rich, it should have a political influence. However, how much influence can a tiny country with 320,000 citizens have? Qatar knew that it would never become a military superpower. So instead, it took three important decisions that transformed the country. Number one, control public opinion. Number two, manage key assets. And number three, be a friend to everyone. So it established the broadcasting network Al Jazeera, which went on to become so successful that it wasn't just the most watched cable news network in the Arab world, but also one of the most watched English news networks in the world. With this little toy, Qatar could now spread its political ideas worldwide, giving it a leverage against its bigger and more powerful neighbors. The next step was to establish the Qatar Investment Authority. The goal behind it was to take the revenue that the country is generating from LNG and invest it in businesses that would keep generating income even when the country runs out of gas. It invested in real estate, the stock market, bonds, sport clubs, and infrastructure projects. As of 2023, Qatar owns more real estate in London than the royal family. The Qatar Investment Authority owns Harrods, the department store, the Shard skyscraper, and is co-owner of Canary Wharf, the Savoy and the Grosvenor House hotels, a 20% stake in Heathrow Airport, and a 14% stake in Sainsbury, Britain's second biggest supermarket group. It owns PSG, the French professional football club based in Paris, one of the most successful football clubs in the world. It has some of the best and most famous players on the planet, such as Messi, Neymar, or Mbappe. And now it is looking to acquire another football club in England. The Qatar Investment Authority also owns 10% of the Volkswagen Group and stakes in many other corporations. The goal of the Wealth Fund was to help Qatar become a non-oil dependable country by 2030. That seems too optimistic since, as of today, Qatar is still heavily relying on oil. But if there is anything that Qatar has proved over the last 30 years is that it is ready to do the impossible, especially now with the opportunity that Russia's invasion of Ukraine has brought to the table. The war has been devastating to both sides, but a great opportunity for Qatar to become even wealthier and more powerful. Over the last 5 decades, Russia has been building pipelines to supply Europe with gas. It was the most effective and the cheapest form of energy. Russia's gas allowed German factories to produce BMWs, Mercedes, and other luxury items at competitive prices. However, with the war in Ukraine, Russia stopped supplying Europe with gas, which shot gas prices to the roof. And since Qatar mainly makes money by selling natural gas, you can imagine how much money Qatar has been making since the start of invasion. But that's not all. Europe, the second wealthiest continent on the planet, began looking at other countries to supply it with gas, and Qatar was at the top of the list. It is no longer 1970s when transporting LNG is super expensive. Qatar has made impressive progress over the years to bring that cost down. Although it is still significantly more expensive than Russia's gas, it is better than nothing. Qatar has already signed multi-billion-dollar deals with many European countries. So tens of billions of dollars will be flowing to Qatar from Europe soon. That sovereign fund is soon going to be much bigger. It might even cross the $1 trillion mark by 2030, making each Qatar citizen worth $3 million just by being born in Qatar. Theoretically, if that money is invested in the S&P 500, assuming it will earn 8% annually, each Qatari citizen will be able to live on $240,000 for the rest of their lives. That is better than most New York salaries. But Qatar knows that it can't just rely on its investment funds. It needs to invest in itself. Unfortunately for Qatar, it is a small population, and the fact that it's a desert, there is very little it can do. Its only hope is to turn into a tourist hub and an offshore peninsula for the rich. And that's exactly what Qatar is trying to be. Qatar has implemented a zero tax policy and invested tens of billions of dollars to build a modern city. However, that didn't catch the attention since its neighboring city Dubai had already become that place in the Middle East. So to overshadow Dubai, Qatar decided to do something else, something so big that it would grab the attention of the world. Host the World Cup. Who would allow Qatar to host such a magnificent event? You need a proper infrastructure for millions of people, a public transport, and many huge stadiums with a capacity of 100,000 people. But if there is anything that Qatar learned was that anything can be sold with money. It threw hundreds of millions of dollars into FIFA and won the 22 World Cup bid. In just 12 years, it built 8 huge modern stadiums, dozens of hotels, an entire city just for the World Cup. I mean, it even built a subway just for this event. And that's how this tiny nation went from being the poorest country in the world to the richest country in the world.